So this notion of seeking the shalom of our communities, seeking the shalom of our neighbors, this is a core calling and a core identity for the people of God.
Welcome to the Reintegrate podcast with Brendan Rumai and me, Bob Robinson. Our special guest today is Dr. Amy Sherman. She is a senior fellow for the Sagamore Institute, where she directs their Center on Faith in Communities. Amy Sherman is the author of 6 books and over 80 articles and essays, including her last book titled Kingdom Calling, Vocational Stewardship for the Common Good from InterVarsity Press, which won Christianity Today's 2013 Book of the Year in Christian Living. It has been one of the most helpful books for us to reintegrate our faith with our work. She has just submitted the manuscript to InterVarsity Press for her next book, which will be titled Agents of Flourishing, Pursuing Shalom in Every Corner of Society. Well, welcome to the podcast, Amy. I really appreciate you being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Could you tell us what you do at the Sagamore Institute?
Yeah, I run something that we call the Center on Faith in Communities, which is a bit of a fancy name. Really, what I do is I am a minister to ministries. So I love coming alongside congregational leaders, nonprofit leaders, ministry leaders, and just really trying to encourage them. I do a lot of training. I do a lot of consulting, coaching. I take on quite a few evaluation projects. I do a lot of writing. So I'm writing toolkits for ministry leaders. I love writing stories that kind of shine the spotlight on great things that folks are doing in community ministry. So really just try to build capacity and hopefully bring some inspiration and encouragement to ministry leaders.
You have a forthcoming book that you told me you just sent in a manuscript to InterVarsity Press.
That's right.
You said it was titled Agents of Flourishing, Pursuing Shalom in Every Corner of Society. Wow, that's awesome. What is shalom, and why should Christians pursue it in every corner of society?
Well, shalom is a really, really beautiful Hebrew word, and our English translation of it typically is the word peace, which captures some, but not really the full meaning of the original word. So shalom really connotes this idea of flourishing. And it's a word that really describes God's normative intentions for his creation and for people. So one of the ways I like to think about shalom is as a fourfold kind of understanding of peace. So peace with God, an intimate relationship with God, peace with self, so psychological wholeness and wellness, peace with other people, so that social dimension, and then peace with the created order itself, whereby people and the planet are kind of coexisting in a interdependent and healthy and mutually beneficial way. So you have this notion of spiritual wholeness, psychological wholeness, social wholeness, and physical or material wholeness. And you put that all together, and that kind of gives you what shalom is about.
I'm going to read an important passage from Jeremiah chapter 29. It starts out by telling us that we're about to read the words of a letter that God led Jeremiah to write to the people who had been ripped away from their homes in Israel and forcefully placed in a pagan nation called Babylon. And so this is what God wants his people to do while they dwell in a nation that does not know the real God. So these words are pretty shocking, I think. Jeremiah 29, I'll start in verse 5. This is what God tells these folks. Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city. Welfare, I guess that's the word shalom there. So seek the shalom of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its shalom you will find your shalom. That's pretty amazing passage. How does that passage impact what you're trying to do, Amy?
Well, this book really is rooted in that passage. I believe that that is a calling not just for the exiles to whom it was written thousands of years ago, but that it's actually a contemporary calling of the church in our day. The church in our day, I believe, is kind of similarly culturally located in the sense that we also have a sense of being in exile. We know theologically, in general, we as New Testament people are called aliens and strangers. So we have this sense of exile because, our world is not coterminous with the kingdom of God, and we are citizens of that heavenly kingdom, even while we're citizens of this world. So there's a very fundamental way in which we are not quite at home right now, but also in our contemporary situation in the West. I think it's also fair to say that the church in our time is sort of culturally located in a posture of exile. If we were ever once at the center, quote unquote, of the culture, we are no longer in that kind of a position, and not everyone, agrees with our fundamental convictions. And I think that God's word through Jeremiah is very relevant for today, not only because of our cultural locus in exile, but also because this call to seek the shalom of others is not just a call that happens there in Jeremiah 29. Really, this is the kind of the fundamental calling all along for God's people. Back in the Garden of Eden, we were called to tend and care for the creation and to bring about its flourishing, and to serve as royal priests in the world, bringing flourishing and wholeness to others. And then that calling kind of gets picked up again when you see Genesis 12, when God calls Abraham to be the leader of his people in the world, who are meant to be a people of blessing. A people that God will bless, and then he will make them a blessing to others, and they're to be kind of a light to the world. And that calling then continues into the New Testament with Jesus saying, my people, I want you to be the salt of the earth and the light of the earth. I want you to, act in such a way that people will see your good deeds and glorify their Father in heaven. So this notion of seeking the shalom of our communities, seeking the shalom of our neighbors, this is a core calling and a core identity for the people of God. So that verse in Jeremiah, I think, Bob, has been kind of picked up by a lot of different church leaders, where I see it on websites and I see it as taglines, and people are talking about, we want to be a church that's seeking the shalom of our community. And I really tried to write this book as a way of providing some rich theological, historical exploration of that, and then also a lot of practical guidance about, what would it actually look like to seek the shalom of our communities.
I love how you went back all the way to Genesis 1 and Genesis 12, the calling for Abraham and his people to be a blessing to all the nations is like the core of who they are as a people. So it kind of struck me as you said that, maybe, Israel wasn't doing so hot of a job in blessing the rest of the nations. And so they are sent into exile, and now they're in a very peculiar position. They're in a very godless nation, and now they have this chance to be the blessing that God has always called them to be. And so that's why he writes this letter. Shalom. You got to seek the flourishing, the best interest of the people around you. That is your calling. And, and so how does that connect for you with the gospel of Jesus Christ?
Jesus as the true Messiah, the true Israelite, Jesus perfectly fulfills this vocation of being a royal priest who brings about the shalom of others. Because we said that shalom in its original understanding is that fourfold peace with God, peace with self, peace with others, and peace with the world. And we are meant as image bearers, to enjoy that peace and to live into that peace and to share that peace and shalom with others. But Israel failed in that vocation, and all of us have really failed in that vocation. But Jesus takes up that mantle, takes up that vocation, and lives the life of the perfect royal priest, who fully loves God, fully loves neighbor, and who sacrificially lives a life of sharing that blessing and extending that shalom to others. And then very dramatically restoring the possibility of that fourfold shalom through his atoning work. So on the cross, Jesus is addressing the fact that in our kind of fundamental position of being in sin and being in exile, instead of peace with God, we have spiritual alienation. Instead of peace with self, we have psychological alienation. Instead of peace with others, we have social alienation. Instead of peace with the created order, we have physical alienation. And that brokenness, all of that brokenness and sin, Jesus takes upon himself, and through the atonement and through the victory over the powers of evil in his resurrection, he is restoring that fourfold shalom. So Jesus's mission, and at the heart of the gospel message is this good news that all that had been lost of shalom, all the dimensions of shalom that had been lost because of our sin and our exile from the garden and the introduction of the corruption of evil into the world, Jesus is repairing all of that through his glorious atonement.
I mean, this gospel is a huge gospel, then, isn't it? It's so much bigger than many of us actually conceive in our heads what the gospel is about.
So it's not just about my own personal salvation.
That's right. And of course, there's a really important part of which it is about our personal salvation.
Right.
I mean, right? God has always been this personal God, the God of Isaac and Jacob. He knows our names. So there's a beautiful dimension of personal salvation. But that personal salvation is part of this larger, beautiful gospel story of, Jesus is not just renewing me and you, he's renewing all things. And if we don't, obviously, if we don't get that, that is really problematic, right? That's not just a sort of, oh gosh, we didn't quite get our theology right. No. If we fail to understand this comprehensive, big, kingdom-sized gospel, we won't really understand what the mission of the church is, or our own personal participation in the mission. Jesus says, "Come and follow me. Come and be part of what I'm doing." If we don't really understand what he's done on the cross, we're not really going to understand our missional vocation in the world.
So for us as Christians, how can we both individually and as congregations go about seeking shalom within our communities?
I hear a lot of ministry leaders express the desire for their congregation to seek the shalom of their community but they're fumbling a little bit to know, well, what does that look like and how do we go about it? And that's really why I wrote this new book, Agents of Flourishing. I discovered some time ago a really helpful framework from some friends and colleagues. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is where the University of Virginia is. And there's a project that was housed at the University of Virginia called the Thriving Cities Group. That project is actually kind of moved to the Ormond Center at Duke University. This Thriving Cities Group put together a framework where they basically are trying to answer the question, kind of what's required for a thriving city. How can we kind of wrap our minds around what a thriving city is? And the key folks involved with this are sociologists, and so it's a sociological framework. But they basically argue that there are these 6 spheres of any society. They call them community endowments. You could think of them as sort of our different arenas or spheres of life. And they call them the good, the true, the beautiful, the just and well-ordered, the prosperous, and the sustainable. And as those names suggest, you can kind of begin to anticipate sort of what kinds of institutions and activities would be taking place in each of those things. And so the realm of the true is the realm of human knowledge and learning, and the realm of the prosperous is the economic life of the community, and the realm of the sustainable is the realm of the natural and physical health and environment. And so the Thriving Cities Group basically argues that a thriving community will be strong in each of these 6 different arenas of life. And what I realized was that when you think about what I would call the marks of true flourishing, or sort of, what does the Bible have to say about what flourishing really is? When you begin to sort of identify what some of those marks of true flourishing are, there's actually some really interesting correspondence between this sociological framework, these 6 community endowments, and those marks. So, for example, the realm of the good is the realm of social ethics and the mores of society, and it has a lot to do with healthy relationships. Well, the first mark of true biblical flourishing would be communion with God and deep relationship with other people. So you sort of see a connection there. Similarly, true biblical flourishing involves real attentiveness to beauty and creativity. And that kind of lines up very well with this idea of the realm of the beautiful, or the community endowment of the beautiful. So I organized the book by these 6 realms of life: the good, the true, the beautiful, the just and well-ordered, the prosperous, and the sustainable. And essentially what I try to do is help church leaders realize, okay, here's what the Bible kind of teaches us about what are God's intentions for how life ought to be within that sphere of society. What can we learn by thinking about how sin has deformed aspects of life within each of those 6 realms? And then what contributions might a church begin to try to make in those different arenas? And churches that have begun kind of playing with this idea, what we've had is church leaders beginning to have some light bulbs come on, where they recognize, oh, when I kind of look at my congregation, I realize that in God's sovereign grace, He's brought us a whole lot of educators, or He's brought us a whole lot of medical folks, or He's brought us a whole lot of business people. And that then begins to kind of clue them into, oh, well, maybe that means that of all these 6 dimensions of how we could try to contribute to the health of our community, maybe the best strategic investment, we could make as a church that has a lot of business people is in this realm of the prosperous, or as a church with a lot of medical people is in the realm of the sustainable, or as a church with a lot of educators in the realm of the true.
So you're taking a secular social construct from sociologists, and you're saying, what do I see this in the Bible? And yes, I do. But my guess is that a secular understanding of these 6 things might differ in some ways from a biblical understanding of these 6 things in some ways. And sometimes they probably are just, they match perfectly, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so one of the things I try to do at the beginning of each of these 6 sort of sections is try to identify, what biblical principles illumine God's normative intentions for these different spheres. And then I try to ask the question, well, because of the fall, we know that sin and corruption have now begun to influence each of those 6 spheres of life. And so I try to do a little bit of thinking about the ways in which we see distortions
Right.
and malformations of how, the fact that how things are in these different realms are not necessarily the way they ought to be. So that congregations will have a sense of, oh, here's the positive things that we see within this realm that align with God's intention. Those are the things we want to bolster, nurture, encourage. And here are those deformations or malformations where we want to resist and bring about a new way of addressing things, bring about new ways of doing things, new norms that are more in alignment with God's principles.
Given our moment in history, in the culture that we're in, when you look at this list, can you pick out a couple that you think right now there's like a gaping hole that the church could be jumping into in society right now?
Right. I think I would want to say no. As an organizing principle for taking a big concept and trying to break it down, it's helpful to sort of look at these things as these 6, distinct buckets or categories. But in fact, in the real world, in any particular community, these 6 dimensions of life, they kind of interpenetrate. And there's overlap, and there's a very dynamic, mutually reinforcing relationship. And as a result of that reality, it's difficult to really be able to sort of say, well, seems like during our time frame, right now, this particular one is really the super weak one, and that's where we really need to focus. Now, having said that, I will slightly make a caveat to my answer, in that I do think that there can be some wisdom in reflecting a little bit about whether there are one or more of these 6 community endowments in your own particular locality that get more attention, either positively get more attention, or that have become, in a sense, the one that's the strongest of that community. But because it's the strongest, on the flip side, it's also become a location of the greatest idolatry. So, for example, you could look at a community like where I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. We're a university town. We have the University of Virginia, there's a tremendous amount of attention on the realm of the true, right? This learning, discovery, knowledge, And with that comes a tremendous sense of intellectual pride. With that comes a kind of sense that the life of the mind is more important than other aspects of life. So in that way, here in Charlottesville, I think it would be reasonable for all churches in Charlottesville to sort of recognize, this is an arena within our own particular locality where we maybe have some both special advantages because of the strengths in this realm, but also some special challenges and idolatries that we need to resist.
At the risk of being too political, so many Christians today of a certain ilk, they think they want to try to preserve their well-being, and therefore the way they preserve their well-being is that they actually fight Babylon. And God's instruction to the Israelites in Babylon was, don't fight Babylon, seek the Shalom of Babylon. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, there's a certain sort of posture or conviction that I bring to the book related to kind of how the church should be in relationship to the culture. And actually, my former pastor, really smart guy named Greg Thompson, talks about this in a paper that he wrote some time ago, where he sort of spells out these different postures. And he talks about, there's the fortress mentality, right? Where the idea is, the culture out there, it's all bad. And so we in the church, we're going to retreat and have this sort of fortress mentality. And we're going to create all of our own institutions, and we're not really going to go out there. And we're going to avoid that bad culture as much as possible. Then there's the posture of domination. What you were talking about. We're going to go out there and we're going to fight. We're going to push back, and we're going to try to take back control. We're going to try to get ourselves back into the center of the public square. And then another posture that is equally problematic is a kind of accommodationism, where it's sort of like, I guess, we just got to kind of go with the flow and be relevant to what's happening here. And we really lose our distinct identity. Listeners who are paying attention to when you were reading that text from Jeremiah would have heard, the letter is telling the exiles both to retain their distinct ethnic identity. They need to continue to be the Jewish people of God with their rituals and marrying within their own community and that sort of thing. So they are to be distinct from pagan Babylon. They're not to just accommodate to whatever the Babylonians are doing. They're to simultaneously be distinct while also loving and serving these pagan neighbors. And that really is the fourth posture that Greg talks about. Not a fortress mentality, not an accommodationism, not a domination paradigm, but a faithful engagement paradigm where we see our relationship as the church to the culture around us as an engagement by which we continue to be faithful to our own identity as the beloved community of God. But at the same time, we are going to be willing to lay down our lives and, like Jesus, be self-sacrificing servants of others, being salt and light in the world.
For our listeners, what first steps would you give them, both as individuals and as congregations? What first steps would you give them to be agents of flourishing in our communities?
I think the very first thing that churches need to do is really a comprehensive audit or inventory of the assets that God has placed into their hands. God is calling us to seek the shalom of our communities, and he has gifted each congregation in, different ways with different kinds of resources and different kinds of people in the pews. And he wants us to steward all that he's given us well and strategically. And we cannot steward well that which we do not recognize we possess. You kind of need to know what the vocational power sitting in your pews is. So you actually need to know, where are all your folks? They gather together on Sundays, but then they go out and they scatter into all of these different 6 realms. Well, who's where? Do you know who the lawyers in your congregation are? Do you know who the carpenters are? Do you know who the artists are? Do you know who's on the school board? One of the groups I do a lot of consulting for is Made to Flourish, and we've put together some tools that I think help churches with these kind of asset inventories. The next step is to try to do a similar kind of inventory of the assets of your community. As you think about serving your communities, that might be the decision to try to serve a particular population group in your community. Like, for example, maybe a lot of refugee families have moved in and you want to serve them well. Or maybe it's a particular neighborhood. I'm at a church where years ago I helped us launch a ministry that was very geographically focused, where we wanted to develop relationships with community members in one particular neighborhood and really work to see the Shalom of God come to greater fruition over the next couple of decades in that particular community. And in either event, just like it's important to see what are the assets and the gifts God has already placed in the congregation that need to be counted and inventoried and then mobilized and strategically deployed for good. Similarly, God has put gifts and talents and resources and assets in these communities, including communities that we sometimes tend to look at exclusively as communities of need. It's always important to recognize that the group that you're going out to serve, or the community you're going out to serve, is not only a community of need. It's also a community of assets that God has placed there that need to be discovered, leveraged, and empowered. And then when it comes to individuals, I think it's kind of similar in that, I think it's really helpful for individuals to understand these kind of 6 community endowments and begin asking questions like, well, which of these 6 arenas do I primarily work in, either as a paid person or as an unpaid laborer? Where do I have the influence? Where am I spending the most time? Which are the dimensions of social life that I'm the most passionate about? I maybe my day job is I am working in the business field in one way or another, but God has given me a great deal of personal interest in, passion for, and some gifting in the realm of the arts. And so we actually might think of ourselves individually trying to serve and love our neighbors by contributing more in the realm of the arts. Whereas another business person will be like, I love business. It's what I do, all day long. It's my day job. Now I can think more strategically about how I can be making a contribution. But this particular book, Brendan, is kind of more focused on what churches can be doing in these different sectors. My earlier book, which Bob so kindly mentioned earlier, the Kingdom Calling book, that one was really more directed to individual believers. And even though it's not organized by that same 6 community endowments framework, a lot of the material in that book, I think, would be helpful for individual believers discerning kind of where they can really make a difference and advance the kingdom based on their own particular vocational skills and interests.
Well, that's very helpful, Amy. Appreciate your taking time to share all that with us. We're looking forward to this book.
Thank you.
It's going to be like a whole year away, though, isn't it?
It is. It's a long ways away. I was hoping that because I handed it in on January 1 that it would be out by the end of this year, but I recently heard back from them, and they're planning it for the early spring of 2022. So it'll be a little while yet.
All that
what can
work.
You do? What can you do?
Now you just have to sit back and wait, right?
That's right. That's right.
Well,
thank you for being interested in it and giving me the opportunity to talk about it with your listeners. I really, really appreciate that very much.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great having you on the show.
Thank you.
I mean, now, of course, we're going to have to sit on this episode for a year till we release it to line up with the release of the book. But
well, we'll do our listeners a favor and just release it as soon as possible.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And then a year from now, I'll re-release
it.
Double dipping. There you go.
I'm double dipping. It's right.
Double dipping. I appreciate that. All right. Well, thank you very much, guys. You have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks.
You too.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Reintegrate podcast. For the latest articles on reintegrating your callings with God's mission, online resources for further learning, and how to get copies of the small group resource, a Bible study book that I authored titled Reintegrate Your Vocation with God's Mission, go to the webpage, re-integrate.org. Remember the dash. You can also find there the Reintegrate podcast page with other episodes and ways to email us to comment on this podcast. That's re-integrate.org.